I'd like to examine a recent article in Vox entitled, "Life in Authoritarian States is Mostly Boring and Tolerable." It has the subheading, "Americans have an overly dramatic view of what the end of democracy looks like." This, to say the least, is an alarming and provocative title. I'm glad an article like this was written. I've seen conservatives on Twitter claiming that Vox was showing its true hand, that they're saying the quiet part out loud. That Vox essentially is attempting to normalize the authoritarian regime that they, i.e., members of the left, want to establish. I disagree with that. I think both the left and the right are guilty of tremendous overreach, especially in the last few years. But this particular article doesn't fit that. It doesn't celebrate totalitarianism. Rather, it points out how very mundane such restrictive regimes can be. It's a warning. It uses the government of Malaysia as an example. Malaysia, according to the article, is not a democracy. It is, quote, a multi-party parliamentary system of government, but the same coalition of parties has been in power for 6 decades. This coalition has never lost a general election. Malaysia's government can exercise the right to detain people without trial, the article notes, and its print and broadcast media are fairly compliant, mostly owned by the corporate allies of political elites. And this media rarely criticize the government. The author, Thomas Popinski, an associate professor of government at Cornell University, notes that his time spent studying Malaysian politics has brought him important perspective as an American. He says that the mental image of authoritarian rule in the minds of most Americans is completely unrealistic, and dangerously so. This vision has jackbooted thugs, all-powerful elites acting with impunity, poverty and desperate hardship for everyone else, strict controls on political expression and mobilization, and a dictator who spends his time ordering the murder and disappearance of his opponents using an effective and wholly compliant security apparatus. This image of authoritarianism comes from the popular media. Dictators in movies, he points out, are never constrained by anything but open insurrection. From American myth-making about the founding, free men throwing off the yoke of British tyranny, and from a kind of imaginary offering in which the opposite of democracy is the absence of everything that characterizes the one democracy that one knows. This article points out that the stereotype Americans have of authoritarian rule is due to the fact that we confuse authoritarianism for totalitarianism. But totalitarianism, as Carl Friedrich and Hannah Arendt, both of whom the article cites, point out, is exceptional as a form of politics. Totalitarianism is much rarer and perhaps much easier to identify than authoritarianism. The reality is, the article says, that everyday life under the kinds of authoritarianism that exist today is very familiar to most Americans. You go to work. You eat your lunch. You go home to your family. There are schools and businesses, and some people make it through hard work and luck. Most people worry about making sure their kids get into good schools. The military is in the barracks, and the police mostly investigate crimes and solve cases. There is political dissent, if rarely open protest, but in general, people are free to complain to one another. There are even elections. This is Malaysia, and many countries like it. So life is boring and tolerable, not outrageous. Most critics, even vocal ones, it says, are not going to be murdered. They're going to be frustrated. Most not very vocal critics will live their lives completely unmolested by the security forces. They will enjoy it when the trains run on time, blame the government when they do not, gripe about their taxes, and save for vacation. Life under authoritarian rule in such situations looks a lot like life in a democracy. As Malaysia's longtime prime minister used to say, "If you don't like me, defeat me in my district." That this could never happen was almost beside the point. There were elections, and the ruling National Front coalition deployed the same language of democracy that American politicians do today. So there's this big question of whether or not we as Americans, or even as humans, will stand for authoritarian rule. That premise, says the article, is grounded on the assumption that life under authoritarian rule is intolerable. It turns out that most people express democratic values, but living in a complicated world in which people care more about more things than just their form of government, feeding their families, educating their children, professional success, it is easy to see that given an orderly society and a functioning economy, democratic politics may become a low priority. The answer to the question, will the people tolerate authoritarian rule, is yes, absolutely. And let's be fair here, there are incredibly low literacy rates in so many major cities. How many people, how many young people are really intimately familiar with how our government works? I have to say, I wonder how well I do on a civics test. If you're wondering what one-party rule might look like in the United States, the article notes that you won't have to look far. The article points out that large swaths of the South were dominated by a single political party during a big chunk of the 20th century. Another sign of living under an authoritarian regime is not that your country suddenly becomes the galactic empire from Star Wars or Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. It's not like stormtroopers are going to come to your door and nab all your guns and your pets. It's not like they're going to start executing ethnic and religious and sexual minorities on pay-per-view and everyone, either cowed into a terrified silence or hypnotized by this novel, wicked ideology, will somehow allow it to happen. Another sign of living under authoritarian regimes, according to the article, is that elections cease to affect real change. Such a shift, as I'm sure you can imagine, might be quite gradual. Our civil liberties might slip so slowly that we don't even notice. We wake up one day without any of the freedoms we've taken for granted. Our institutions might bear the same names or profess the same values, but they no longer serve the functions they once did, and our possibilities are narrowed. If the takeover happens right under our noses, or if we notice, but it's not catastrophic enough to inspire outrage or sufficient action, it stands a much better chance of success. The fantasy of authoritarianism, writes Popinski, distracts Americans from the mundane ways in which the mechanisms of political competition and checks and balances can erode. Democracy has not survived because the alternatives are acutely horrible, and if it ends, it will not end in a bang. It is more likely that democracy ends with a whimper, when the case for supporting it, the case, that is, for everyday democracy, is no longer compelling. What sort of development would make it no longer compelling? I think in order to answer that question, it's necessary to ask ourselves why we want freedom to begin with, and what this freedom really consists of. That's exactly what I'm going to address in my next video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send some comments below, like and subscribe, and yeah, stay tuned.